Have you ever wondered how the world of Pokemon works? Like how its ecosystem works, and how each creature came to be through the power of science or whatever other forces exist in their world? I've wondered this for a long time, which is why I've spent the last 3 months going through every Pokedex entry and diving deep into the real-world study of comparative biology and phylogenetics to determine the most scientific and lore-accurate origins of every Pokemon in the entire Pokemon kingdom. God is real, and he has forsaken us! The world of Pokemon. A spinning globe of wonderment, home to an infinite array of creatures too varied to fully comprehend. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, meticulously fashioned by the forces of nature in all its glory as only nature can. That's it, the intro's over. I just really wanted to do that. Anyway, Pokemon origins. While the vast majority of Pokemon we see in-game did in fact evolve naturally into their various species from a single common ancestor, just like in the real world, not all of them are as naturally occurring in the way you'd think. I began my research by going through the in-game lore, taking into account some aspects of the anime and the manga to find out what the established lore of Pokemon actually is, and it's way more insane than you'd think. To begin the origins of Pokemon, I need you to hold my hand and have an open mind as we walk into a bout of biblical speculation on creationism. So before we get biological, let's get a little religious. There is a confirmed canon creation myth to the world of Pokemon, and it goes a little like this. In the beginning, there was the Great Egg. When it hatched, the first Pokemon Arceus was born. Arceus created existence itself in its first act, serving as the catalyst for the birth of all things. Arceus began creating creatures in waves to expand existence, and with the first generation of creations, Arceus made the Creation Trio. Dialga, the ruler of time, Palkia, the ruler of space, and Giratina, the ruler of antimatter. Each creature created their own dimensions, that of time, space, and a place known as the Distortion World, respectively, but these weren't enough for life to exist. Past this point, I'll be taking some speculatory positions based on in-lore evidence. In the next generation of creations, Arceus needed to bring about a more complex design, so they created Unknown to serve as a sort of programming language of the universe. The Unknown were given their own dimension of vast psychic power, allowing them to create illusions and form the blueprint of creation. We see this dimension whenever the Creation Trio rips holes in the fabric of reality, and Unknown are vastly more powerful in their home according to the in-game text in the Pokedex. So I believe that these commonalities with the Creation Trio and their unique abilities in home plane point to them being creations of Arceus. Arceus then brought about the rulers of land, sea, and sky, Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza. While Groudon and Kyogre rapidly formed the lands and oceans of the world as they fought, their fighting was always quelled by Rayquaza, whom descended from its home in the upper atmosphere to ensure the bickering ceased. As the lands began to take shape, Arceus brought about a great and powerful titan, Regigigas, to tow the continents in place by hand, bringing variety to the landmasses and seas alike. And finally, to serve as its servants and envoys, Arceus created Latios and Latia. I almost said Latinas. I just love Latinas, Sonic. To serve as its most trusted envoys, Arceus created Latios and Latias. A little known fact about these Pokemon, they're actually known as the Aeon Pokemon, leading me to believe they're based on Aeons, angels from the Gnostic religion that always come in pairs of male and female. Latios and Latias possess the power to communicate with any living creature telepathically or emotionally, and are able to shapeshift to humans even, and are able to move at great speeds to be the perfect servants of their lord, like divine messengers of Arceus. In the third generation, Arceus brought about the beginnings of life on the planet. They brought about the 4 forces of nature to establish weather and the cycle of seasons. They brought about the duo of life and death to begin and end the life cycle, and brought about their guardian to ensure the life cycle and wider ecosystem stay balanced. Arceus then created Mew, who was the first Pokemon to populate the world in vast numbers and would be the ancestor of almost all Pokemon that followed. Lastly, in this generation, Celebi was created. Now, this claim is contentious because some people believe Dialga created Celebi due to Dialga being the ruler of time. However, at no point do we witness Dialga create life in canon, so I believe Celebi was created by Arceus for a different purpose. Celebi is a being of purity, which can move through time, purifying the world at all points it can find the corruption of darkness in. I believe that Arceus, knowing that in order for the universe to exist, Arceus must himself be born, created the Great Egg and tasked Celebi with delivering it to before existence, knowing that Celebi is a being of purity that it could trust. Arceus essentially used the bootstrap paradox to create the world with the help of Celebi. The last generation that Arceus brought about served as gifts to the now blossoming world full all of thousands of incredible creatures known as Pokémon. These gifts were the Wish Granters and Guardians of Fate, known as Yuxi, the Bringer of Knowledge, Azelf, the Bringer of Willpower, Mesprit, the Bringer of Emotions, Jirachi, the Bringer of Wishes, and Ho-Oh, the Bringer of Rebirth. But not Lugia! These creatures all brought their gifts to the inhabitants of the world, and so after many eons passed, we arrive in the modern day. Why did Arceus grant us these gifts? I have no idea. God spent 90% of the movie screaming, "Justice!" and then nuking the planet, bombing children like his name's Benjamin Roethlisberger, that is. He drops the bomb, Hail Mary, touchdown! Pokemon from outer space, and alternate dimensions, and moon x-rays, and time, and the ghost world. And you know what? There's actually a lot of Pokemon from a lot of places. I've covered all of the God-created Pokemon, but there are actually dozens of Pokemon that don't even come from Earth, or were created intentionally by other Pokemon, or were made by complete accident. For example, several Pokemon come from space, like Eternatus and the Clefailine, and everybody knows that Deoxys came from space. But did you know that Deoxys and Staryu most likely come from the same organism? While both Pokemon come from space, the similarities run much deeper than that. Both of their bodies are completely replaceable, as the only organ in their body is their crystal core. They can regenerate any part of this body except for their cores, which serve as the brains. And both creatures are capable of immense psychic ability, especially after Staryu evolves into Starmie. So I posit that the psychic space virus that Deoxys comes from takes the shape of its crystalline core and has since branched off into both species of Pokemon, wherever in space they come from. Pokemon also come from other dimensions, such as the Ultra Beasts, coming from the Ultra Dimension, which is like our dimension, but sponsored by Red Bull. Now that everyone over the age of 30 and balding is terrified, let's talk about the Paradox Pokemon. Paradox Pokemon come from the Paradox Dimensions, which, while I'm at it, let me clarify a common misconception. Paradox Pokemon are not from another time. Paradox Pokemon aren't actually from the past and future. That's why they're called Paradox Pokemon. They literally can't exist in the normal Pokemon world naturally. Instead, they were clearly pulled from prehistoric and futuristic alternate dimensions using a dimension-shattering machine powered by a crystal turtle made by a robot modeled after Spanish Gordon Ramsay's parents. Obviously. There are also some minor miscellaneous dimensions that the games don't actually go into depth on, like whatever alternate reality Hoopa came from, or the World of Spirits, which is mentioned in several Pokedex entries and shown twice in the anime, so there's nothing really to explain about them other than that they exist, and here's a bunch of Pokemon that are from there. As for artificial Pokemon, humans have created a ton of them, so I won't explain them just yet in the video, but let's go over some examples. Although stay tuned, because I made something awesome that will explain them all. I promise this video covers every Pokemon. Some Pokemon were created intentionally by ancient civilizations, such as guardians like Golett, Golurk, and most likely Sigilyph. They're based on Nazca lines, so they're probably artificial. While others were created in the modern day, like Porygon. Porygon was actually first discovered in the ancient past of Hisui, where they fell through a time distortion portal into the past from the modern day, which means the idea for creating them in the future came from the past, which means they themselves are a massive paradox of creation, which is pretty fun actually. Mewtwo was made by splicing the DNA of Mew, but splicing with what? Human DNA. Human DNA being the DNA of what I call the evolutionary Pokemon, but we'll get to humans being Pokemon canonically later. Human DNA is what causes Mewtwo to desire to create new Pokemon, and because humans are so versatile, that's likely why Mewtwo possesses multiple Mega Evolutions and a more human personality and shape than Mew. In the in-game text, it's referenced that Mewtwo's DNA was actually spliced to Mew DNA, and in the manga, we see that Dr. Fuji, who is also referenced in-game as being in charge of the Mewtwo project, and Dr. Blaine, the gym leader, used Dr. Blaine's DNA as the DNA spliced with Mew. I think some version of these events are also canon in game, as they produce the same result, which is a more human-shaped Pokemon, Mewtwo. But wait, I also believe that every failed attempt at cloning Mew prior to the DNA splicing resulted in Ditto, a self-replicating Pokemon that can't breed with itself because it instead duplicates via mitosis. Ditto is only found in the ruins of the Mewtwo Project Lab in the Kanto region, and it's the only Pokemon that can transform like Mew. Plus, they're both pink with light blue shinies, so in my opinion, it's pretty clear that that's where Ditto comes from. Some Pokemon weren't created by humans, though. Some were created by legendaries. Ho-Oh granted the gift of rebirth to the legendary beasts when they died in the Brass Tower fire. Regigigas also created the legendary Titans in its loneliness and boredom with the materials it could find in nature, which were the elemental energies, but I'll get into those in a little bit when I explain why type has nothing to do with Pokemon phylogenetics. Other artificially created Pokemon were complete accidents, like the Grimer line. They were made when, quote, industrial sludge in a stream came in contact with X-rays from the moon. What? Well, at least the grammar line got an explanation, even if it's a stupid one. Charcadet's Dex entry says that it was made when, quote, burnt charcoal came to life and became a Pokemon. Cool, very nice.
I am also saying something.
That's not even the most insane one, though. Here's how Vanillite was born. When the morning sun hit an icicle, it wished not to melt, and thus Vanillite was born. This implies inanimate objects have desire in the Pokemon universe, but we're going to ignore that while determining the origins of every Pokemon for the sake of my therapist. If you add up all biblical, extraterrestrial, and artificial Pokemon together, you'd have a little more than 100, but I promised at the beginning of the video to cover all 1,000 plus Pokemon, and I will. That's because I'm about to give you all 900 plus remaining origins at once, and every extraterrestrial and artificial Pokemon I haven't covered yet, and I'm actually gonna give you a free digital poster I made while I'm at it. You see, for the last couple months, I've been deeply researching real-world phylogenetics, which is the study of the evolutionary history of organisms, to determine what Pokemon would evolve and branch off into new species over time based on their analogous species in our world. And I did all of this for the sake of making an incredible chart of every Pokemon's origin. Also, yes, I do plan to release a new version every time a new game comes out, because I'm never truly done with this video, I guess. Let's start by establishing what criteria matter for categorization. For one, the word evolution as it's used in game isn't actually evolution as it's known in biology. When a Charmander evolves into a Charmeleon and then again into a Charizard, and then they mate and produce an egg with another Charizard, what hatches from the egg is a Charmander. Therefore, each Pokemon in a living evolutionary line is part of the same species. The Pokemon aren't evolving, they're actually metamorphosizing. They do this through epigenetics, which is when something, be an external stressor or internal change, basically speaking, causes a creature to become a new form, often one less energy efficient but more capable of self-defense, like me emerging from my basement at 3 a.m. to eat a fistful of yogurt and shredded cheese to assume my final form. Or like a caterpillar turning into a cocoon and then emerging as a butterfly. Oh, nice. Game Theory actually has a fantastic video talking about this exact thing, so I'll link that in the description. I'm pretty sure those little guys could use the views much more than a big shot like, when were there 3,000 of you? Where did you people come from? 2 months ago I had 200. How did you people find me? I promise I'll get back to Pokemon in a moment. I just really need to thank all of you from the bottom of my heart for the amount of kind comments and support I've gotten over the past couple weeks. It's been unreal and I really appreciate it. But I'll get back to Pokemon because I'll save the gushing for another time.
Blah, blah, blah. Who even is that guy? We want Pokemon. It's Pokemon time. Back to Pokemon.
The second consideration we need to take is that these are Pokemon, not real-world animals. So there are some facts us professional biologists are just gonna have to accept. All Pokemon that can mate lay eggs, regardless of if they're an insect, a reptile, a mammal, a plant, an ice cream cone, a washing machine, industrial sludge, God. We just have to accept that and move on. Also, when some Pokemon metamorphosize, they take on a wild amount of new traits, like gaining more limbs or appearing to become an entirely new class of creature. But because not all Pokemon have to evolve, since there are many examples of the lowest form of a Pokemon aging and passing away without ever undergoing a metamorphosis, we're going to have to base the phylogenetic classification of each Pokemon on their first forms. However, we will take into account later forms if metamorphosis is an actual part of their life cycle, like with many of the insect Pokemon. That means that this is a fish, which means that this is also a fish. This is a fish, okay? It's a fish. You understand a little bit of my pain now, but that doesn't change that this is a fish, no matter how hard we wish it wasn't. Also, some Pokemon are actually multiple creatures, making up a single Pokemon able to be captured by a single Pokeball, such as Paris, who is the bug part of the Pokemon themselves, but are infested by Tochukaso spores. Tandemouse and Mousehold are a great example of 2 or more creatures that together make a single Pokemon, and so are Phalanx, but my favorite example of this is Deerling and Sawsbuck. They're actually normal-type Pokemon whose antlers are infested by plant life, allowing them to photosynthesize, so it's symbiosis that gives them their grass typing. Lastly, Pokemon type wasn't factored into the phylogenetic path of Pokemon because type appears to be based on elemental energies present in the world of Pokemon, which influence the power a species develops over time. This means rapid changes in type can quickly occur between classifications, kind of like how real-world species can quickly adapt to their environment through survival of the fittest. Now, without further ado, behold the chart! I'm actually really proud of this chart, which took real months away from my life and is packed full of detail and includes the origins of every Pokemon we've talked about so far at the top and more, along with the explanations for why they're there, as well as just a ton of fun facts scattered throughout. Before I dive too deep into the chart though, I need to do my due diligence on behalf of actual scientists and clear some common misconceptions. For one, the further we go up from the tree from the origin of life, it does not mean that organisms are becoming more complex or more evolved. This chart is purely meant to show common ancestry in Pokemon with nodes and branches that indicate what Pokemon is more closely related to another. However, because there's only a little over 1,000 Pokemon at the time of this video, the number of connections is a bit misleading in some cases, because I can't fill the chart with the millions and millions of dividing species we have in the real world. I chose this format of chart because it's much more visibly appealing and pretty to look at as a poster. If I wanted it to be as accurate as possible, it would have looked like this, which would have been equally challenging and way less fun to look at. Also, I'm going to try to show the chart as much as I can, but it's 100 megabytes, so whenever I put it in Premiere Pro, I risk detonating the city block around me. To help with the creation of the cladogram, I had to consult with my resident expert in the field of biology, my friend Professor Kenny. As a deeply knowledgeable and self-described phylogenetics and comparative biology enthusiast, he and I were able to have incredibly complex and nuanced conversations about the taxonomy of Pokemon.
So slime molds are these things that can spread out like that and send tentacle shoots out.
I do like that Shuckle
I think
being a
that's
slime
what
mold.
Shuckle's based off of. Okay, that being said, if we're actually considering Shuckle an amoeba, it should not have eyes or a shell.
Shut the fuck up. Well, the shell? As we learned going through the roster of all Pokemon, appearances can be deeply deceiving in the Pokemon world. What you may believe is an eye like Graphii is actually classified as Scandentia because it comes from Shroodle, which is actually a species adjacent to our real world's tree shrews. And when you look at them long enough, you can kinda see it. Then there's a seemingly straightforward shot like Whale Lord, who seems like a whale, but has the fin structure of a shark, lateral swimming like a whale, no dorsal fin at all, unlike modern whale, and while it acts like a baleen whale, it has teeth. Horrifying teeth. We still concluded it's a cetacean, like whales, dolphins, and porpoises of some kind, but most similar to the real-world Georgicadus, but it's honestly a bit more nuanced than that. In a similar vein, Dondozo, the big catfish Pokemon, has a horizontal tail that it uses to swim up and down like a whale, unlike fish who have vertical tails and swim side to side. To be fair though, it does use this weird vertical tail to swim side to side, and it has gills, so it's safe to say it's a fish, but this inconsistency annoyed the shit out of me and my friend. Because I love these fun facts, I'll give you my favorite one. Clam Pearl is a fish, not a clam. The first egg that hatches releases the fully developed protective shell that guards the still developing Pokemon. The pearl is actually an eel egg. This eel egg hatches after environmental factors turn it into a fully grown eel, as we can see in Gorbis and Huntail, and when compared side by side with real eel eggs, that theory actually is pretty clearly true. The more we explored options through the Pokedex, the titles of Pokemon became extremely misleading, like how Cradilly is called the barnacle Pokemon despite being a crinoid, making it an echinoderm and not a crustacean, and therefore not a barnacle, which, if you didn't know, are animals and are closely related to crabs. Orthworm is named Orthworm the Earthworm Pokemon. Despite being called Orthworm the Earthworm, it has an exoskeleton and 6 legs, making it a caterpillar. We almost even classified them as pseudopods and called it a mollusk, but I stopped us from doing that before the madness could strip us of our mortal flesh. Going back to the chart, I'd like to introduce you to a completely new classification of life at the bottom, a group I call Expiravitae. These Pokemon are literally born from death, as some Pokemon need to die in order for new Pokemon to be born. Some of these Pokemon come from dead dogs, like Greavard, and some come from unspecified spirits, like Honedge and Bramblin, and some Pokemon, like Ghastly and Phantump, come from humans, like Professor Magnolia any day now. My favorite of these Expiravitae are Frostlass and Glalie, which are both the evolutions of Snorunt, but Snorunt isn't actually the origin of the Pokemon line. You see, Glalie and Frostlass are both born from humans that got lost and died in frozen environments like mountaintops. Then, when they breed, they produce Snorunt, which can evolve into either of them based on gender. This is the only example of a Pokemon evolution actually being the origin species, which bred a fully living species of Pokemon that can turn into either of them, which is fascinating. However, Expiravitae are not all ghost types, or ghosts in general. Cryogonal are the spirits of people who died on snowy mountains as well, but they actually aren't ghost type. On the flip side, several ghost types like Mischievous, Sableye, and Skeledirge are fully living and breathing beings, who eat food to survive and are not spirits at all. Delmise are actually just the seaweed according to its dex entry, and gain its ghost typing from the lingering emotions of the dead who died in shipwrecks that it attaches to. The ghost type itself appears to be based more on aesthetic than any scientific basis, which if anything proves that type is based on elemental energies and not anything else. The only recognizable pattern is that most ghost types, regardless of being resurrected, reanimated, or fully living creatures, is the evolutionary adaptation of being able to feed on or manipulate life force, or souls. That ability is consistently mentioned in seemingly every ghost type Pokedex entry at some point, which is probably just a property of having elemental ghost energy, but it could have been an evolved trait. This aesthetic rule actually actually applies to most types, as they're more aesthetics than functional ways to categorize Pokemon. For example, not all bug types are insects or even arthropods, and not all dragon types are Dracaris. Pokemon like Shelmet are bug types, despite being mollusks, while a Pokemon like Flygon isn't a bug type, but is conclusively an insect. Then there's Pokemon like Dragalge, which is a dragon type despite being a fish, and Alolan Executor, which is a tree. Yeah, I'm not sure on that one either. Now that types are all cleared up, let's take a look at the star of the show, the chart. Starting from the Origin of Life Mew, there was a couple possibilities on how we could have actually made this chart. We could spend decades begging Nintendo to send us genetic samples of all of the Pokemon, or we could base it on reality. I went with the second option. Mew is capable of transforming into any Pokemon, but at the beginning of life, it wouldn't have had any Pokemon to model itself after. Logic would dictate that it would transform into simple organisms and gain complexity over time as it learned to better transform, which is why every single Pokemon is a eukaryote. Mew just lacked creativity. As more and more Mew bred while transformed, they created life forms they had transformed into as species separate from their own. I'm back. Just like how their failed clones, Ditto, can give birth to other species of Pokemon while they transform into them and mate. The kingdoms of life that Mew transformed into over time were Protists, Anomalia, Fungi, Plantae, and a kingdom I named Divisa Vitae, Latin for divided life. I believe that as Mew transformed into plants and animals, some Mew decided to transform into both, creating a kingdom of creatures with both plant and animal cells, which doesn't actually exist in the real world. Starting with the smallest kingdom, Protists, we only have 3 examples of them, all of which are amoebas. There's obvious amoebas like Solosis, which resemble single-celled organisms but are likely amoeba collectives, but then there's less obvious amoebas like Meltan. Meltan group up into groups of over 1,000 to metamorphosize, which is very similarly to how Dictyostellum do in nature when they also group up to form Melmetal. Shuckle is the most interesting protist because despite its appearance resembling some kind of turtle or worm, it's actually an endolith, and specifically a slime mold growing throughout the rock. You can see this in its visual appearance and its literal Pokedex entry, which I didn't notice until after classifying it as a slime mold, which was an embarrassing waste of time on my part. Moving on to the second smallest kingdom, we have fungi. Most of these are straightforward mushrooms, but the coughing line seems a little bit less obvious. Coughing appear to be floating fungal spore colonies, and while some plants do have spores, coughing can't learn synthesis, which is pretty damning of any plant theories. They hold toxic gases that are lighter than air in their bodies, allowing them to float, which to me is similar to how some fungi spread their spores. They also evolve into wheezing whenever 2 coughing meld together over time, which is a very mycelial network of them, so I believe the evolutionary line are fungi. Moving on to Divisa Vitae, each of these Pokemon have direct references in their Pokedex entries to having both plant and animal cells as part of their bodies from birth. I decided to model them like a microcosm of the animal kingdom, since that would be easier, and most of them have much more variety in their animal parts than their plant parts. I don't really think there's any surprises on this part of the chart, but I really like Dole over here, so let's take a moment to appreciate him before I move on to the next kingdom. Let's play nice with Dole. I'm just going to go over the highlights of the remaining kingdoms because I don't want this video to be 30 hours long. But if you stay to the end, I'll give you a code to download the full poster yourself to look at as much as you want. Over in the protostomes, I've invented a new class of mollusks known as mineralisks. These Pokemon hide their fleshy bodies under shells like most other mollusks, but by using electromagnetism, they pull minerals to their body as their armor coating. Most of these Pokemon are capable of floating from their magnetic abilities, and I think the best example of them is Geodude, as perhaps one of the earliest mineralisks to have evolved. As mineralisks got more complex, I propose they learn to wield these magnetic abilities in different ways, from pulling rocks to their bodies to make pseudolimbs like the filter feeder Onyx, to generating heat to magnetize molten materials like Heatran, to even magnetic Pokemon that developed psychic abilities from this telekinesis-like power like Metagross and Magnemite. Moving on over to arthropods, surprise surprise, it's a ton of bugs. However, there are some fun ones here, like how Sudowoodo's limb count and camouflage make it most analogous to a real-world stick bug, or how Volcanion is most likely a beetle, similar to the Bombardier beetle, which sprays superheated liquid chemicals in real life. I believe Tyranitar is an insect. It has an exoskeleton, a head crest, and even pupates halfway through its life cycle. It's literally called Pupitar, so don't argue with me on this one, okay? It's probably closely related to Heracross. Moving on, I'm now going to completely skip fish. Not only did researching them take me way too many weeks, since what we know about them is constantly changing, there's honestly just not really many surprises in the fish category, if you could believe it, so I hope you enjoyed looking at it in the background. Wait, I forgot about echinoderms. Everybody always forgets about echinoderms. Well, that sucks for them. Anyway, moving on. Did you know that Tangela is based on red seaweed, which isn't actually red? Well, you do now. Plants are boring, let's do dinosaurs. Oh wait, before we do dinosaurs, here's the amphibians. There's way more axolotls than I expected, and that's all I have to say. Over in the dinosaurs, we have what you'd expect for the most part. But just before where the birds evolved is where I put Draconis, the dragon-shaped Pokemon. I believe Druddigon was one of the first with its tiny, barely functional proto-wings, and Charmander was the first to develop wings that were truly functional, even if they're locked behind an epigenetic marker. Now, could literally all dragons except Druddigon be considered lizards and snakes? Yes. But this is cooler. My favorite part about the birds is the legendary birds, because their Galarian forms are one of the only canonical cases of mistaken identity. They're not adjacent species, they just coincidentally look like the original legendary birds. In some cases, they're quite distantly related, like with Moltres and Galarian Moltres, and I just think that's really neat. I've been talking so fast, I'm gonna slow down now. Also, it's mammal time, yay! Psyduck isn't a duck, it's actually a platypus. When you look closely at their designs, it's actually pretty obvious between the web feet and the claws with the duckbill and the tail, and that makes them the only monotremes. There are so many different mammals in the Pokemon world. They're by far the most common type, and it's not even remotely close, so I'm going to let you explore the mammal chart on your own, and if you don't want to do that, then here's some footage of what the rest of the chart looks like. But what I want to end off on is the most powerful and influential Pokemon of all time. Going up to the primates, we see the ones you'd expect, like monkeys and greater apes, but we also see a massive array of humanoid Pokemon. Some create technologies, some have psychic powers, and some train in martial arts, but there's only one Pokemon that does all of the above and more. Me! Humans are what I call the evolutionary Pokemon. We have a symbiotic relationship with Pokemon because we have the unique ability of spurring unnatural growth in them. We have invented items to give Pokemon more powerful evolutions of themselves. We have trained them to be more powerful and more intelligent than they could be alone, and we do it all as a Pokemon ourselves. In the actual lore of Pokemon, it is said that there was once a time where humans and Pokemon were indistinguishable, and Pokemon-human marriages often occurred. Humans are capable of learning psychic and fighting moves, can communicate with Pokemon when they bond enough, and other Pokemon are capable of learning human speech, so it's not a unique trait of humans. Humans are likely pure normal type, as we literally kill each other with martial arts that we designed, making us weak to fighting type moves and immune to ghost, which is true. Have you ever seen a ghost in real life? Didn't fucking think so! But you may ask, but Pokemon lay eggs! You can't prove we don't lay eggs, so I'm correct! This is my reality, and you are living in it, whether you like it or not! If you disagree with me and say that humans don't come from eggs, I dare you to send me a clip of a human giving live birth in the Pokemon universe. I'll wait! I am amongst their kingdom, and they shall revere me as a vassal of their lord. In the name of the great Arceus, I dedicate my life. I'm so tired. I've left the link in the description so you can download the poster if you want. Anyone can download it completely for free, although be warned the file size is huge. I think it'd make an amazing poster, and I hope you all like it. And if you have any questions about the chart or why Pokemon ended up where they did and I didn't cover it in the video, please ask me in the comments and I'll answer. Please, please ask me in the comments. I am burdened by knowledge, and I've spent way too long thinking about Pokemon phylogenetics. I beg to be asked questions. You can ask me anything, even like just how I'm doing. Oh hey Winter, what's your favorite Pokemon? It's Hisui and Zoroark. Thanks for asking, friend, although I am partial to Mew lately, and actually maybe now Scarada? I mean, I guess you don't have to ask me anymore since I just said that. Is the video over yet?